We used your wedding fund to finish Kayla's house. She deserves a real start. You will be fine with a backyard thing." Carl said it across the Sunday dinner table, like he was commenting on the weather, not rewriting the last promise my mother ever made to me. For a second, everything in that Overland Park dining room went quiet and sharp. My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. Wedding fund. The two words hit harder than any shout. That money was not just savings, it was the college bonds my grandmother put in my name and the small policy my mom paid into every month from her job at the dental clinic. It was the envelope she once tapped and said, "This is for the day you are finally chosen Jenna." Now it was drywall and paint in Kayla's house. Across from me, my younger sister leaned back in her chair, manicured fingers around a glass of wine Carl had just refilled. She smiled like none of this was strange at all. "It is not just a house," she said. "It is my brand. I will shoot all my content there. The kitchen light is insane." Carl topped off her glass again, then reached for the pitcher of water and poured some into mine. "You are driving," he added. "You always make the responsible choice." On the surface, it sounded thoughtful. Underneath it translated the way it always did in this house. "You do not need anything. You will be fine." My heart dropped, but my face stayed exactly where 34 years with him had trained it to stay calm and small. I set my fork down, folded my napkin, focused on breathing past the tightness in my chest. Around me, I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the clink of Kayla's bracelet, the soft tap of my fiancé Dan's fingers on the table beside my plate. Dan's silence felt louder than any speech. Carl was not finished. "You do not need a big wedding, Jenna," he said. "You are practical. You are the type who clips coupons and does spreadsheets for fun." Kayla laughed. "And Dan seems chill," she added. "I am sure he will not mind a grill out and some Costco cupcakes." I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. My whole childhood in this house had taught me that my tears were an inconvenience and my anger was a joke. I took a slow breath that burned a little and turned my head toward Dan. His shoulders were tense. His jaw clenched. His eyes met mine, and in that look, I saw the line we had just crossed. Carl leaned back, pleased with his own logic. "Besides, your mom's money went to good use," he said. "It helped build Kayla's dream. Is that not what Linda would have wanted?" My mother's name made my stomach twist. Linda. The woman who used to sit at this same table and squeeze my hand under it when Carl's jokes cut too deep. The woman who told me more than once there is a little something set aside for you, just for you. Her picture now hung on the far wall, pushed off the mantel to make room for a wooden sign about family. At the end of the table, my Aunt Marlene set down her fork. "Linda told me that money was for Jenna's future Carl," she said quietly. She was very clear about that. The air went heavy. Even Kayla stopped scrolling. Carl turned his head and gave Marlene a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. "You must have misremembered," he replied. "Jenna has always been fine. Kayla actually needs help. Fine." That was the word that had followed me since childhood, like a label I never agreed to wear. The fine one. The stable one. The girl who packed her own lunches and filled out her own forms so the adults could pour their time into the child with the bright smile and the big stories. On paper, I look exactly like what Carl believes. 34, just an accounting clerk in his words. The woman who handles other people's numbers. Most days, I sit in a windowless office at the Heartland Grocers headquarters in Kansas City, tracking data for 40 stores, so budgets do not bleed out. Dan, the man sitting next to me now, teaches personal finance part-time at the community college. You might think that would impress someone who claims to care about stability. Instead, over salad, Carl had asked him, "So, what do you make in a year, Dan?" "Enough to keep her in a decent rental." In Carl's story, I was always one step from needing his rescue, and never once at the center of the plan. Kayla was our real spark in his words. Me, I was the stable one in the background, the support beam no one notices until it cracks. While he talked now, my phone lit up on the table beside my plate, a small square of light against the wood. I glanced down and saw the notification. Rental deposit received. Maple Duplex LLC. I locked the screen before anyone could look over. Carl had no idea that the woman he was dismissing as a coupon clipper could buy Kayla's new house twice in cash if she wanted. He did not know about the stock plan at work the years I spent saying no to trips, so I could say yes to assets the old duplex on Maple Street that I gutted and now rent to a young family who pays on time every month. And the worst part was that for me, this moment was not about being able to replace the money. It was about my mother sitting at a chipped kitchen table telling me there is something with your name on it, Jenna, and trusting him to honor that. He had taken the last thing she tried to leave just for me and folded it into Kayla's brand. Across from me, Kayla showed Aunt Marlene photos of shiplap and custom shelves. My eyes slid past them to my mother's picture in the corner. My throat burned. Something inside me that had bent around other people's comfort for years began to feel dangerously close to breaking. Dan's chair scraped back across the hardwood. The sound cut straight through the quiet conversations. He stood up slowly, pulled his phone from his pocket, and looked directly at Carl. "Carl," he said, "are you absolutely sure you want to describe what you did as using Linda's money?" The room shifted. Kayla's smile vanished. Her hand froze mid-swipe. Carl gave a short laugh that sounded thinner than before. "Of course," he said. "It is family money." Dan glanced down at me. His eyes asked a clear question. "Are you done letting them do this to you?" I held his gaze and felt something solid rise in my chest where the numbness usually lived. I was tired of being the one who was always fine, so everyone else could be fragile and special. Dan turned back to Carl. His voice stayed calm, but every word landed hard. "Because where I come from," he said, "there is another word for this. And if Jenna wants me to, I can start making some calls on Monday." For the first time all night, Carl's jaw tightened. He did not look so sure of himself. I looked at my fiancé standing there then, at my mother's picture pushed to the side so a generic quote could own the middle of the wall. That was the night my stepdad stole the last thing my mother tried to leave just for me. It was also the night I decided I was done letting them think I was the poor, quiet one. Before I take you back to where this really started, tell me something. If your stepdad used your mother's money to buy your sister a content house, what would you have done at that table? I am genuinely curious. I grew up learning that in some homes, love was measured not by what was given, but by what was withheld. And when I think back to those early years in the small apartment my mother, Linda, and I shared in Kansas City, I can still feel the soft thud of her shoes on the old carpet each night as she came home from the dental clinic, smelling faintly of mint polish and exhaustion, yet smiling at me as if I were the reason she kept going, because in her words, she was saving a little each month for my future, and she said it the same way every time with a gentle tap on my forehead that made me believe the world outside our door was not as loud or as unkind as it actually was. I was 10 when she met Carl during a renovation project at her clinic, and I remember how he laughed too loudly at his own jokes and how his boots tracked a trail of dust across the tiles. But Mom told me he was hardworking and stable, and that stability mattered more than anything because she had raised me alone for so long, and I tried to trust her, I really did, because she looked happy for the first time in years. So when she married him and we moved to Overland Park, into a house that felt too big and too polished, I tried to make myself small enough to fit into whatever space he would allow me, hoping it would help keep the peace. At first he pretended to like me and brought home a used bicycle with peeling paint, but told everyone it was practically new and called me Big Helper instead of daughter, as if my existence was more chore than child, and back then I laughed it off because Mom smiled nervously every time he used that phrase, as though she knew something was off but hoped it would fix itself. When Kayla was born, the entire house tilted toward her like flowers tracking the sun, and I learned quickly that my role was to hold the shadows steady, while Carl shined every bright thing on his little girl. So by the time I turned 12, My birthday had been merged with Kayla's without discussion, and I watched a cake arrive with her name in bold letters, while my name was squeezed into a corner like an afterthought, and Carl smirked as he placed extra candles around Kayla and told me I was old enough to share the spotlight because babies needed more attention, and I remember swallowing the lump in my throat so hard it hurt, because Mom was standing right there whispering that she had a small account at the credit union under my name, and one day it would help with college, or maybe my wedding. Whichever came first, and her voice trembled just a bit, as though she knew that what she could not give me publicly, she needed to promise me privately. I clung to that promise more than she probably realized, because in that house, I learned every rule by observing Carl, and his moods learned when to disappear, and when to nod, and when to laugh, even when nothing was funny. And by the time I hit 15, I believed that being agreeable was the only way to avoid conflict, which is why when he walked into the kitchen one afternoon carrying a stack of papers from the bank and told me to sign them so he could move things into a better account because it was grown-up stuff, I took the pen he handed me and signed without asking questions and without looking up long enough to see the flicker of satisfaction cross his eyes. I remember my hand shaking just a little because I did not want to disappoint him and because Mom was out running errands and I wanted him to be proud of me for once. And the moment I finished scribbling my name, he patted my shoulder in a stiff, awkward way and said, "Good girl." Before sliding the papers back into a folder and locking it in the drawer, he always kept his personal documents in, and I told myself it was no big deal, that it was probably some minor financial housekeeping. Only years later would I learn that signature was not harmless at all, but the first moment he reached into what was supposed to be mine and redirected it entirely for himself. But back then, I had no idea. I only felt the faint unease of something shifting, but could not name it because children in homes like ours are trained to swallow instinct until it stops speaking. Looking back now, I can see how that moment shaped the way I moved through the rest of my teenage years, how it taught me that needing less was safer than asking for what was fair, how every sarcastic comment he threw at me became a lesson in silence, how every comparison to Kayla nudged me deeper into the role of the girl who never asked for anything. By 16, I was working part-time at Heartland Grocers, bagging groceries and learning how to count change faster than the register could scan it, and customers would compliment me for being sharp, while Carl would shrug and say, "At least she is learning something practical. Maybe she can be my unpaid bookkeeper one day," and Mom would wince, but never correct him because she was tired and the peace was fragile. When my manager invited me to help reconcile the evening reports because I caught errors, no one else noticed. I felt a small spark of pride, but Carl brushed it off, saying, "Paperwork is not real work, and you should watch how Kayla practices cheer routines. She has real drive and real talent." And I learned again that anything I did would always be measured against his golden child. That was the first time I realized the house was not a home, but a hierarchy, and I was perched firmly at the bottom. By the end of high school, I knew how to survive by being the fine one, the girl who caused no trouble, the one who did not demand attention or resources, the one who fit in the space left over after Carl and Kayla took everything they wanted, and I carried that lesson silently for years, never imagining how deeply it would shape the moment he sat across from me decades later and told me he had used my wedding fund to finish Kayla's house. It was the same pattern repeated on a larger scale, the same entitlement, the same assumption that I would accept it quietly, and the same expectation that I would not fight back because I never had before. But what Carl did not know, and what I had not yet revealed even to Dan, was that the girl he taught to stay small had quietly learned another skill, growing up the ability to watch carefully, to understand the flow of money, and to build something of her own right under his nose. Something that would one day give me the leverage he never imagined I possessed. And it all began with that moment when he told me to sign without reading, and I obeyed, because I did not yet realize he was teaching me not obedience but strategy, the strategy of knowing exactly how injustice begins, so one day I could end it. I was 16 when I discovered that survival in a house like ours meant not only staying quiet but learning how to build a life outside of it, piece by piece, shift by shift, and that discovery began at Heartland Grocers, where the fluorescent lights hummed above me each afternoon as I slipped behind the register after school, telling myself that earning my own money would at least give me a small kind of freedom, a freedom no one in that house could take away or twist into something I did not recognize. And in those early weeks, I learned that I could count bills and coins faster than the machine could register them, which made customers smile and managers raise their eyebrows because I corrected small errors as if my fingers could sense patterns before my eyes even caught them. I never bragged about it at home because I knew exactly what Carl would say, and he did not disappoint when I mentioned my new job one evening while clearing dishes, and he wiped his hands on a towel and said, "At least you are learning something useful. Maybe you will be my free bookkeeper someday," the corners of his mouth lifting in that familiar smirk that told me he thought he was being clever, not cruel. And I nodded, even though the comment stung, because praise was not something he gave, and I had long ago accepted that any acknowledgement from him would arrive wrapped in condescension. Meanwhile, Kayla, barely younger than me, but always treated as if she were the crown jewel of the house, was handed keys to a used but shiny convertible, because Carl said every girl needs to feel special behind the wheel, and he paid her cheerleading fees without blinking. He bought her outfits with team logos embroidered on the sleeves. He blamed her low grades on the school system because he said she was creative, not academic. And never once did I hear him ask her to be responsible for anything, not chores, not expenses, not even her own excuses. And the contrast between us widened like a crack in the floor that kept stretching with every passing month. Mom knew it too, even if she rarely said it aloud, and sometimes when Carl and Kayla were out, she would sit on the edge of my bed, brushing hair from my forehead the same way she did when I was little, and whisper, "I am still saving for you, sweetheart." Kayla has her dad to take care of her, but you only have me. And I remember how her voice softened whenever she said that, as if she knew the world expected me to hold myself together more tightly than anyone my age should have to. By 17, I was doing more than scanning groceries because the manager noticed how quickly I caught mistakes on the daily report, and one afternoon he called me into the tiny office behind the bakery, where everything smelled like warm bread, and handed me a small stack of printouts pointing at mismatched totals and saying, "Can you take a look at these because you see patterns most people miss?" And that sentence stayed with me in a way. Compliments from home never did, because it felt honest and earned and rooted in something I could build a future on. When I told Mom, she hugged me in the kitchen with flour still on her hands from baking cookies for a church event and whispered, "See, I told you you had a gift," and for a moment everything in the world felt aligned. But that moment shattered the second. Carl came in through the back door and asked what we were talking about, and when Mom proudly repeated that I was helping with office reports now, he scoffed and said, "So basically, you are doing paperwork, not real work, like building houses, dismissing months of effort with a single breath, as though numbers did not run the world he depended on." And I felt that old familiar heat climb up my neck as I swallowed my response, because arguing with him never led anywhere, except to another reminder that in his eyes, my path was always going to be small, safe, unremarkable. Yet something shifted in me after that because despite his dismissal, despite how he made paperwork sound like a weakness rather than a skill, I felt a quiet certainty begin to grow, the kind that hums beneath your ribs like a promise you do not yet have the language for. And I realized that maybe he could not see value in what I did, because value to him only existed in things he could measure by weight or wood or brick. But the world he underestimated, the world of ledgers and patterns and financial insight, was a world I understood instinctively in a way he never would. At 18, I was handling evening reconciliations for an entire store, double-checking vendor invoices, flagging inconsistencies that turned out to be real discrepancies, earning the trust of managers twice my age, and I kept all of it quiet at home because I had learned one undeniable truth by then, that anything I built needed to be built far away from the reach of a man who believed that anything belonging to the household naturally belonged to him. And gradually, I saw how my ability with numbers gave me something rare in that environment. Clarity, and that clarity became the foundation for every step I took afterward, even if I did not yet know that it would one day give me the power to stand across from Carl at a dinner table as an adult and finally refuse to let him reduce me to the girl who should be grateful for whatever scraps he decided were appropriate. But at the time, all I knew was that every shift I worked, every report I straightened, every small paycheck that went into the savings account I kept secret from him was one more piece of proof that I could rely on myself, that I could grow beyond the limitations he tried to impose, and that my life did not have to follow the script he wrote for me. By the time I graduated high school, I had already become someone who could manage her own world quietly. Someone who knew her worth even if she could not say it aloud, yet someone who understood that the ability to see patterns was not just a skill, but a shield I would keep polishing in silence until the day came when I finally needed to use it. By the time I turned 22, I had already learned how to shape my life quietly and deliberately, and after finishing community college, I transferred my credits and completed my accounting degree while still working evenings at Heartland, because tuition was only manageable if I paid for every class myself, which meant no nights out, no new clothes, and no unnecessary expenses, only spreadsheets, textbooks, and the slow accumulation of skills that I knew would eventually carry me farther than anyone in my family expected. And when Heartland offered me a full-time role as a junior analyst at the Kansas City headquarters, I accepted without hesitation, because the moment I stepped into that building with its cold air vents and endless rows of data screens, I felt something settle inside me. The sense that numbers made more sense than people, that patterns told the truth more reliably than the voices I grew up around. At family gatherings, the news that I had been hired as a financial analyst slid across the table like an unimportant footnote, because Carl shrugged and said, "So you crunch numbers for a grocery chain stable, but not exciting." And he added that Kayla was doing social media, and one viral video would set her up for life, a sentence that made everyone laugh except me, because I knew he meant it. He valued potential fame more than quiet competence, and it reminded me again that in his eyes what I did was simply paperwork, no matter how complex or impactful it was. I kept my head down, saved every bonus, tracked every expense in a spreadsheet, color-coded so precisely it would have made my professors proud. And while my coworkers spent weekends celebrating promotions, I spent mine reading about investment strategies and rental markets and how to make your first property cash flow positive. Because even though I had never said it aloud, I knew I wanted a life built on independence, a life no one could revoke with a single signature on a document. I did not understand the way Carl had once tricked me into signing when I was a teenager. The shift came in 2020 on a rainy Wednesday, when I discovered a pricing inconsistency in one of our vendor import files, a discrepancy small enough that most analysts would have dismissed it, but significant enough that if unnoticed, it would have cost the company thousands every quarter. And after I traced the issue and notified the senior team, the CEO called me into a small conference room and thanked me for catching a flaw in the system that could have spiraled into a much larger leak. Then he surprised me by offering me participation in the company's restricted stock program for early career employees with exceptional performance. And for the first time, I felt the weight of financial possibility settle into my hands, discreet and powerful and infinitely mine. I told no one at home because I could already imagine Carl's response, his questions, his attempts to understand how my success could become his asset, and instead I opened a separate brokerage account under a small LLC I created to keep my financial life cleanly divided from anything tied to my family name. And those shares sat there quietly accumulating value like a secret inheritance I had built for myself. By late 2021, I had enough saved through bonuses, dividends, and a modest emergency fund to put an offer on a worn-down duplex on Maple Street, a property most people would have overlooked because of its sagging porch and peeling paint. But when I ran the numbers and estimated the rental revenue, I saw the potential clearly, and I bought it with a mix of savings and a small loan approved solely on my income, because my credit score had climbed steadily, thanks to years of cautious management, and for months I spent weekends painting walls, repairing fixtures, learning how to install flooring and documenting every expense in a spreadsheet that grew to more than 30 tabs, a quiet empire in cells and formulas. When the duplex finally rented, I remember the first deposit notification on my phone lighting up during a Sunday dinner, and how I instinctively flipped the screen downward because no one at that table needed to know that I now owned a property, that I had tenants whose rent covered the mortgage entirely, that I had built something substantial with no one's help, because if they knew, Carl would find ways to twist it into something he had shaped, rather than something I had earned. To them, I was still the girl living in a modest apartment, driving an aging sedan and keeping her life small. And Carl reinforced that narrative one evening when he looked at me over a plate of roast chicken and said, "You are almost 30 and still renting. You should ask your sister how to market yourself better, since presentation matters, especially for women." And Kayla laughed while scrolling on her phone, showing off a video she had filmed in flattering lighting, while I sat there quietly noting that the duplex payment had already cleared that morning, that I was not renting. But I let him believe I was, because the truth felt like a rare jewel I was not willing to expose to people who had proven they would only try to claim it. What stung in those moments was not the insult itself, but the reminder of how easily the world judged women by what they displayed, rather than what they built by the shine of their lifestyle, rather than the depth of their discipline. And I realized that the invisibility forced on me in childhood had become a tool in adulthood, because the less they expected of me, the more room I had to grow in silence. While Kayla curated her online presence with soft lighting and posed laughter, I curated a life of tangible assets and growing stability, one that no algorithm could erase. And as 2022 closed, I found myself sitting at my small dining table, surrounded by spreadsheets, bank statements, and a quiet pride that I would never voice out loud, the pride of knowing that while my family minimized my work and dismissed my path, I had been building something enduring, brick by brick, line by line, with no one noticing enough to take it away from me. When my mother first found the lump, she brushed it off as a swollen gland from a seasonal cold. But within weeks, her voice grew softer, and her shoulders slumped with a kind of tiredness I had never seen before. And by the time the oncologist said the words, "breast cancer," I felt something tighten in my chest, like a string pulled too hard and beginning to fray. And from that moment forward, the hospital in Kansas City became a second home, where fluorescent lights hummed through long hallways and the scent of sanitizer settled into my clothes, as if marking me as someone who waited for news, someone who listened for breathing patterns, someone who understood what fear sounded like when it slipped through the cracks of nightly conversations. I spent most evenings after work sitting by her bed, holding her hand, while she drifted in and out of sleep. And even though I tried to keep my voice steady, she always sensed the tremor behind it, and she would squeeze my fingers very lightly and whisper, "There is a policy and some savings, and I told Carl they are for you, for college, or a wedding, or a down payment, or whatever. Helps you finally feel chosen." Her words soft but deliberate, as if she was trying to anchor me to a future she was afraid she would not see. I nodded every time, blinking back the sting in my eyes, feeling the weight of something sacred in her promise, something like a final attempt to rebalance years of uneven love in our home. And the thought that she saw my invisibility even when I hid it made me hold her hand tighter. The contrast between her understanding and the life outside that hospital room grew sharper every day, because while I stood beside her, listening to her breathe, Kayla appeared mostly on a screen, posting filtered selfies and outfit videos captioned with manifesting positivity while hardly showing up in person, and Carl treated her absence like a natural fact, shrugging and saying, "She is building her brand. You know how busy she is," while I quietly handed nurses' forms and fetched blankets and learned the polite language of doctors who could not promise anything. When Carl did show up, he carried himself like a foreman, walking a job site, greeting staff loudly, bringing sandwiches no one asked for, and giving instructions, as if he had authority in a world ruled by medical charts and quiet patience. And one night, after hearing my mother mention the savings, he stepped into the room with an air of confident interruption and said, "I will handle the paperwork. She does not need to worry about anything while she is sick." And though his tone annoyed me, I did not have the energy to challenge it because my mother looked relieved simply to hear someone else volunteer to oversee details she was too tired to manage. Weeks passed like that, a slow erosion of her strength and a steady rise in Carl's involvement, until one afternoon I arrived after work and found him unfurling a stack of documents at the foot of her bed while she looked at them with hesitant eyes, and he said, "This is just an update for the will and the beneficiaries, so everything is simpler. No stress, no confusion, just signatures to make things easier for everyone." My mother glanced at me and said, "It is still for you, honey. We are just making it easier for Carl to manage until you need it." And something in her voice, thin but trusting, made me swallow my questions, because the last thing I wanted was to cause her more strain. So I stood there beside her bed, nodding gently as she signed each page while Carl hovered with a pen and a rehearsed smile. I did not know then that those papers were not simplifying anything for anyone, except Carl, who had decided to fold every asset insurance policy and savings note into accounts under his sole control, erasing anything that indicated the money was meant for me. And I did not know because I trusted my mother and she trusted him. And I could not bring myself to imagine that a man who claimed to love her would take advantage of her weakest moment to rewrite the meaning of her final gifts. After months of treatment, she slipped away peacefully in a hospital room dimmed for comfort. And when we gathered for the modest funeral that followed, I sat beside my Aunt Marlene, holding a small photo of my mother, while Carl shook hands and spoke about Linda's strength as if he were the one who had sat by her side every night. And a few weeks later, when he received the life insurance payout, he assured me the wedding fund was untouched, separate, secure. And because I was drowning in grief, and because I still wanted to believe he maintained at least some integrity, I did not check. Looking back, that silence was one of the few things I wish I could undo, not because of the money itself, but because it allowed him to continue his narrative that I was fine without anything concrete, that Kayla needed the spotlight and I did not, and that he could handle the family finances without oversight. I returned to work shortly after the funeral because spreadsheets made more sense than condolences, and I told myself that grief had no timetable, and if I kept moving forward, maybe I could outrun the hole left in my life. But in quiet moments, I felt a strange ache blooming behind the thought of my mother's final assurances, the way she had spoken about that policy as if it were a small guarantee that her love would reach me even when she no longer could, and the guilt of not protecting that promise simmered beneath everything I did, soft but persistent, waiting for the moment it would surface again with unmistakable clarity. I met Dan 2 years after my mother passed at a night class called Personal Finance for Working Adults, a title that made me smile the moment I saw it, because I signed up mostly out of curiosity, wondering how many people would mix up net and gross or forget how compound interest actually worked. And on the first evening, he sat 2 seats to my left taking notes, with an intensity that would have intimidated me, if not for the fact that he occasionally glanced up at the instructor with the same skeptical eyebrow I wore whenever someone explained a concept too loosely. And when we partnered for a short exercise on calculating retirement timelines, he looked at my sheet and said, "Most people do not understand compounding at this level. How long have you been doing this?" And I shrugged and said long enough to know it matters more than people think. We started talking after class, walking out to the parking lot where streetlights flickered softly, and the air smelled like late autumn leaves. And what surprised me was how easy conversation felt, how he listened carefully, without pushing, how he admired details I had always kept quiet about, like the way I annotated my notebook, or how precise my projections were. And soon, our casual chats turned into coffee, and then dinners, and eventually weekends, spent strolling farmers markets or sitting in my small apartment eating simple meals in a quiet comfort that felt like breathing for the first time after years of holding everything in. One night early on, he asked about my family, and I watched him notice the way my shoulders tightened before I even spoke. And I told him pieces of the truth without painting the full picture, explaining that my stepfather valued Kayla's ambitions while dismissing my work as dull paperwork, that I was used to being the reasonable one who took up the least space. And he said gently that he understood complicated family dynamics, but he had no interest in forcing anything until I felt ready. The turning point came unexpectedly on a Saturday morning when he stopped by my apartment while I was organizing quarterly statements for the duplex, and he noticed a folder on my dining table labeled Maple Duplex LLC, and he paused before touching it and asked lightly, "Is this something you want me to ignore?" And I told him it was fine to look because I trusted him, and he opened it and stared at the rental income spreadsheets for a long moment before saying, "This is not a side thing. Jenna, this is a legitimate real estate business." And I felt an old instinct rise in me, urging me to minimize it, so I answered, "It is just one property, nothing huge, but..." He shook his head and said quietly, "You built this entirely on your own. You need to give yourself credit." I admitted then that I also held some stock through work that my company had rewarded me for catching a major issue, and I explained that I kept everything private because I had seen how my mother's savings were treated like a community pool for the family, how anything with my name on it somehow became negotiable once Carl decided he had a better use for it. And Dan looked at me with a seriousness I had not expected and said, "Your money is yours. Your story is yours. I will follow your lead with your family," and hearing that made something warm and steady settle inside me, a safety I had never experienced before. Our relationship deepened naturally over the months that followed, slow and grounding, and one evening on the Missouri riverfront as the sun dipped low behind the water, Dan knelt with a small ring box in his hands and asked me to marry him, his voice shaking slightly in a way that made me love him even more, and I said yes, with tears burning at the corners of my eyes, feeling an overwhelming relief that someone had finally chosen me because I was steady, rather than in spite of it. I chose a simple silicone band to wear daily, leaving the real ring in a safe box at home, because I liked the idea of keeping something precious tucked away. Just for me, a habit I had learned from years of guarding every fragile thing in my life. And when we went to share the engagement news with my family, the contrast between that intimate riverside moment and the chaos inside Carl's house hit me immediately. We barely stepped inside before Carl leaned back in his chair and asked Dan, "So how much do you make in a year?" Not even pretending interest in me or our happiness. And Dan blinked in surprise while I felt a familiar flush of humiliation crawl up my throat, especially when Kayla piped up dramatically saying, "Please do not have one of those depressing office weddings. I will literally die if my followers think my sister got married next to a photocopier." And she laughed like she had delivered a brilliant joke while I stood there with a polite smile that hid the deep sting her words left behind. As we sat down, I decided to test Carl something I rarely dared to do, and I mentioned lightly that Mom had set aside a wedding fund for me, wondering how he would react, and he picked up his fork without even looking at me and said, "We kept it safe." "Jenna, do not worry your pretty little head about numbers. That is my job." And I felt my jaw tighten so sharply I thought I might chip a tooth, because he was speaking to a senior financial analyst as if she were a child dismissing both my intelligence and my mother's intentions in one casual sweep. Dan glanced at me with a look that said he knew exactly how insulting it was. And even though I did not confront Carl in that moment, something inside me shifted, a small spark that whispered, "You cannot keep letting them define you like this." And I found myself gripping my hands under the table, holding on to the knowledge he did not have, the knowledge that I was not the helpless girl he believed I still was, the knowledge that one day, soon everything he assumed about me would collapse under the weight of the truth he never cared to ask for. The night of the dinner stayed in my body like a bruise that kept darkening with every breath, and when I replay it now, I can see every detail with painful clarity, the way the overhead light flickered slightly above the dining table in Carl's house in Overland Park, the way the smell of roasted chicken felt strangely sour the moment he looked at me with that satisfied smirk and repeated what he thought was a perfectly reasonable announcement. And even though the hook already tells the first blow, it did not capture the full avalanche that followed after he delivered the line about using my wedding fund for Kayla's future. He leaned back in his chair with the confidence of a man who believed his decisions were absolute, then picked up his phone and said, "Let me show you something since you probably have not seen it yet," and he swiped through photos until the screen lit up with a glossy image of a newly finished kitchen granite countertop, shining under pendant lights, a massive center island with white oak panels, a perfectly staged corner for filming. And he said proudly, "This is Kayla's house." Look at that craftsmanship. The contractor really outdid himself on the studio room. Kayla, sitting across from me in a dress tight enough to look like a costume, tossed her hair and announced, "It is not just a house, it is my brand. I will shoot all my content there," and she smiled like the world was already applauding her. Carl kept scrolling, showing images of a freshly painted basement, a sound-treated wall, professional lighting rigs installed on the ceiling, and then he delivered the killer line with a casual confidence that hit me harder than anything he had said earlier. "We use Linda's money to finish the basement. Kayla will make so much content down there. It will pay off in no time." And the words floated across the table like a slap that landed over and over, because he was talking about the one thing my mother had carefully protected for me. The one thing she whispered about in hospital rooms when she thought she was leaving me a small promise of future joy. Aunt Marlene put down her fork slowly, her face tightening with the effort of remaining polite, and she said quietly, "Jenna first. That is what your mother said she meant for Jenna to have that security." And Carl turned to her with a cold dismissiveness that made my stomach knot, saying, "Linda is not here I am, and I decided what is best for the family." His voice booming as if he expected applause for his authority. I did not speak because my throat had closed, the tightness rising from my chest to the back of my jaw until I felt like any attempt to talk would come out as a broken gasp. So I just sat there staring at the tablecloth pattern while Kayla scrolled on her phone and whispered to Carl that the exposed brick in the basement looked so good on camera. And when he reached for the wine bottle to top off her glass, but handed me a cup of water instead, saying, "You are driving and you always make the responsible choice." The humiliation twisted deeper, not just because of the gesture, but because of the tone behind it, the implication that my restraint existed for his convenience. Dan sat beside me, silent but tense, his fingers drumming lightly on the table in the rhythm he used when he was trying to hold himself together, and I could feel the anger radiating off him like heat. But he waited until we were in the car before he finally spoke, and when he did, his voice cracked with fury. "They stole from you, Jenna. They stole from your mother." And I could not remember a single time I had heard him sound that way before. The streetlights blurred past the windshield as I stared straight ahead, trying to process everything, and part of me felt numb, while another part felt like long buried fire was beginning to wake in my chest. And Dan finally said, "Do you hear me? They stole from you." But I only whispered, "I know," because anything louder would have shattered something inside me. After a long stretch of silence, he asked quietly, "Why you never checked the account?" And I told him the truth, that grief made me trust what I should have questioned, that I believed Carl when he said everything was separate, that I wanted so badly to honor what my mother intended that I convinced myself nothing could be wrong. And Dan shook his head slowly in disbelief. That was when I did something I had never planned to do. Not yet, not this soon, but the violation of that night pushed me past a threshold I did not know was there. So I pulled out my phone and opened the app linked to the accounts I kept entirely separate from my family's knowledge. Without speaking, I handed it to him, watching the glow of the screen illuminate his face as he scrolled, watching his expression shift from confusion to realization to shock as he saw the portfolio total at the top, the number hovering around $1.3 million built from ESPP stock Heartland, granted me from index funds I contributed to religiously from the duplex that had begun producing consistent returns. His breath caught, and he whispered, "Jenna, you have been sitting on this," and I nodded because there was no point pretending anymore. And when I said, "I do not need the wedding fund," Dan. His eyes widened at the weight of the sentence because he finally understood that need was never the issue, and I continued softly, "It was the only time Mom said, 'This is just for you,' the only moment she tried to carve out a piece of the world meant for me alone, and he turned it into a basement prop for Kayla's Instagram, and that is what broke me." The words came out in a trembling whisper, but the truth behind them felt solid and sharp like metal, and as Dan reached over to take my hand, I saw something in his expression I had not seen since my mother died, a determination that matched my own, a silent promise that this would not end the way Carl expected, because he still believed I was the quiet one, the one who would accept whatever was handed to her, the one who would swallow injustice out of habit. But as the car rolled through the dark streets of Overland Park, I realized something had shifted permanently, that the life I had built in silence was no longer something I needed to hide, and that this betrayal would be the final mistake Carl would ever make with anything that carried my name. I did not sleep much in the days after that dinner. My body would lie down because it was tired, but my mind kept replaying every moment the way Carl said, "Linda is not here, I am," as if that sentence alone gave him the right to rewrite everything she had promised me, the way I sat there, swallowing the words that rose to my tongue, because silence was the oldest habit I owned, and in that stretch of nights, the guilt crept in, heavier than the anger. A slow weight that whispered, "You let him do this, Jenna. You let him take her last gift and turn it into a set for your sister's videos." I stared at the ceiling in my bedroom, the shapes of streetlights shifting across the plaster, thinking of every time I had looked away, the time I signed papers at 15 without reading them, because I wanted him to approve of me the day in the hospital. When I watched Mom sign the updated documents while telling me it was still meant for my future. The years I accepted his jokes about my paperwork job as if they were harmless, and each memory felt like a small betrayal layered over the bigger one, until I almost could not breathe with the weight of it. More than once I found myself whispering into the dark, "I am sorry, Mom. I let him rewrite what you wanted, and the words tasted bitter, because I had built a life on paying attention to details everywhere, except in the one place that mattered most, my own family." Dan noticed the change in me. Long before I named it, he would find me at the kitchen table at 2 a.m. with a mug of cold coffee and my laptop open, and instead of telling me to calm down, he would sit across from me and wait. Until one night, he finally asked a question that cut straight through the fog. If this were one of your store managers, misusing funds, what would you do? The simplicity of it startled me for a moment. I saw a spreadsheet in my head. Instead of the dining room, I saw account lines instead of Carl's face. And for the first time since that dinner, the part of my brain that knew how to solve problems woke up and sat up straight. At work, if a manager mishandled company money, I did not sit in the break room complaining about how unfair it was. I gathered the data, checked the policies, talked to the right people. Documented. Everything escalated if necessary. I treated it like what it was. Not a personal insult, but a financial breach, and that realization slid into place like a lock clicking. I looked at Dan, and he must have seen the shift because he nodded slightly and said, "You do not have to keep being their child in this story. You can be who you are every day in the office, the analyst, the woman who sees patterns most people miss," and his words landed with a clarity that cut through weeks of emotional noise. I realized that for years I had been living in two versions, the competent professional who handled budgets and the quiet daughter who let her stepfather decide what her mother's promises meant, and that division had kept me stuck. But it did not have to anymore. So I took a deep breath and told him I wanted to treat this exactly like a financial case. And he said, then start where you would start at work. Start with the numbers. The next day, after work, I drove to the credit union where my mother had opened her first account. When it was just the two of us, the building still had the same blue trim and the same faded poster about saving for college, and my hands shook a little as I walked inside. Not from fear, but from the feeling that I was finally stepping into a role I should have claimed years ago. A woman at the desk looked up and recognized me, and when I explained quietly that I needed to see what I was allowed to see about my mother's old accounts, because I suspected some things had not been handled the way she intended, her expression softened, and she said she would do what she could within the rules. We sat in a small office while she pulled up records, and as she scrolled through transaction histories and account notes, I watched pieces of the past align with dates in my memory like a puzzle. I had never been allowed to complete the bond, redemptions from my grandmother, the transfers into joint accounts, the withdrawals that lined up with Carl's new truck, and with early renovation payments for Kayla's house. Each line was a small revelation and also a confirmation of what my gut had already suspected, that the money earmarked for me had been steadily folded into whatever story suited Carl at the time. After I left the branch, I drove home in silence, the folder of printed statements on the passenger seat, feeling heavier than its actual weight. And when I spread everything out on my dining table that night, I opened a new file on my laptop and named it Carl Case. A reminder that this was not just a vague sense of hurt, but a series of decisions and transactions that could be traced and confronted. I started building a timeline listing dates in one column, amounts in another, notes about what was happening in our family at the time beside them, and as I filled in the rows, the story began to tell itself in tidy cells and numbers, cold and undeniable, in a way that pure emotion alone could never be. Then I went through my old email folders and found messages from my mother, short notes she had sent during treatment reminders about policy documents or mentions of appointments with their insurance agent, and I took screenshots and added them to a folder labeled Supporting Evidence, pairing them with the corresponding financial records, so that each memory had a matching line of proof. I even dug out the worn notebook she used to keep in the kitchen drawer, and in between notes about milk and dish soap, there were tiny lines that said things like, call credit union about Jenna account, or confirm beneficiary on policy. For Jay, and seeing those phrases in her handwriting lit a quiet fire in my chest, a rage at the gap between what she meant and what Carl had done. With every document I scanned, every line I highlighted, I felt myself shifting from victim to investigator, from the girl who sat frozen at the dinner table to the woman who could walk into a room with a folder full of facts and hold her own. And that shift was not loud or dramatic, but it was profound because for the first time since my mother's death, I was not just reacting to what Carl did, I was preparing to respond in a language he could not dismiss, the language of numbers, contracts, and consequences. The next morning, I drove back to the credit union with my folder of timelines and statements, and even before I stepped through the glass doors, I felt a cold steadiness settle in my chest, a feeling I recognized from audits at work when something smelled wrong, and I knew the numbers would prove it. So when I sat down across from the loan officer who had known me since I was a teenager, bagging groceries after school, I simply told her I needed to understand what had happened with my mother's accounts over the years because some things were not adding up. And she nodded with a seriousness that told me she had seen this kind of story before. As she logged in and pulled up the archived accounts, I could already feel a tightening behind my ribs. And when the first line item appeared, I knew why, because right there in black and white was the educational bond my grandmother had purchased specifically for me when I was 11, redeemed early without clear justification, and moved into a joint account under Carl and Linda. And I remembered Linda telling me once that those bonds were untouchable until I needed them for college or a wedding. And now here they were, erased from my future, before I was even old enough to understand financial forms. The loan officer clicked again, and the next set of transactions appeared, and this time the date lined up neatly with the month Carl bought his new truck, a truck he justified as necessary for his contracting work. And my stomach tightened as I traced the movement of money on the screen. My funds moved to joint, then withdrawn in one lump sum, then a matching purchase at a dealership across town, and I heard my own breath in my ears like a dull roar. She kept scrolling, and the pattern grew clearer. Life insurance from my grandfather deposited to the same joint account and then siphoned off into an account solely in Carl's name within weeks of the funeral, all perfectly timed, all disguised as routine transfers. And I felt a cold thought settle over me that this was never a single betrayal over a wedding fund. This was a system, a plan, a long habit of taking whatever he wanted and assuming no one would ever look close enough to challenge him. Then the screen revealed the transaction that made my hands shake, a digital authorization dated during my freshman year of college, labeled "Authorized by Jenna Cole." And the loan officer frowned because the signature did not match my digital signature on file. And the description indicated a beneficiary change paired with a durable authority document, exactly the kind of form Carl had slid in front of me years ago, saying, "Just sign here, it is grown-up stuff." And I felt a wave of nausea crest through me as the memory came back in perfect clarity. Me sitting at the kitchen table wanting him to think I was cooperative, wanting Linda to stop looking anxious and signing without reading, while he nodded as if I were a child doing a chore. This one line explained everything: how he had gained legal control, how he had quietly rerouted every asset intended for me, how he had built the illusion of order while stripping my future, bit by bit. And for the first time since my mother died, I felt something hotter than grief, a sharp, clean anger that had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with justice. When I showed Dan the printouts that night, he went still, then told me we needed to talk to someone who knew how these cases worked, someone who could tell us what counted as elder financial exploitation and what fell into the gray zone of family decisions. And the next morning I scheduled a consultation with an attorney who specialized in financial abuse of aging or ill family members. I paid the retainer from a small side account I kept for property expenses, and the ease with which I could pay it seemed to shock the attorney slightly. But what mattered to me was the look on his face as he flipped through the timeline I had built. The murmured, "This is not nothing. This is a pattern. This is intentional." And for the first time, I felt a small piece of power return to me. Not vindictive power, but the strength that comes from naming what has been done. The attorney explained that the legal road would not be clean because many signatures technically belonged to Linda, even if they were influenced, and some transfers fell into the murky category of marital assets. But he said the misuse of funds that were clearly earmarked for a specific beneficiary, paired with a signature obtained from a minor without explanation or informed consent, opened a door, not a wide one, but one we could walk through if we were methodical. He asked whether I wanted restitution or accountability, and I told him I wanted the truth to be too loud for Carl to talk over, and he nodded slowly and said that was possible. He laid out a plan first, a formal letter requesting mediation supported by documentation. Then if Carl refused an escalation into a civil petition that would place his financial actions under review. And as he spoke, I realized that for the first time in my life, I was not thinking about how Carl would react. I was thinking about what was right. Before we left, he also mentioned something else, an option he did not suggest. lightly that if Carl was mixing business funds from his contracting company with personal accounts, especially accounts containing insurance or bond redemptions, there could be regulatory consequences, possibly tax reporting issues or licensing concerns. And he said a complaint could be filed anonymously if we wanted to apply pressure, only if he denied everything. On the drive home, I held the folder against my lap and thought about that suggestion like it was a sharp instrument, one I did not want to use, but one I needed to know I could hold if Carl kept pretending he had done nothing wrong. This was no longer about money. I had more than enough savings and assets to build my own life without a cent from him. But it was about the narrative he had built for years, the one where I was the responsible one who needed nothing, while Kayla was the spark who deserved everything. And now I had evidence that the truth was the opposite, that he had taken from the daughter who asked for nothing to fund the daughter who demanded everything. And as I placed the folder into my locked drawer that night, I felt a strange calm move through me, the kind that comes before a storm, the kind that says, "You are done being quiet." The fellowship hall was already buzzing when Dan and I walked in, that familiar echo of folding chairs scraping against the polished floor, the smell of potluck casseroles drifting from the kitchen, the soft hum of polite small talk moving around the room as if everyone were waiting for permission to start judging one another. And of course, Carl thrived in places like this, spaces where image mattered more than substance, where a man who donated a few $1,000s could parade himself as a pillar of moral authority. He had insisted on being a gold sponsor for the roof restoration fund, his business logo printed proudly on the banner near the podium. And as he shook hands with the pastor and a few city council volunteers, I could see the satisfaction rolling off him in waves, as if every handshake confirmed his version of himself. The benevolent provider, the man who raised 2 girls and launched one of them into a glamorous new chapter with a house he claimed she built through hard work. Kayla was there too, filming pieces of the event for her followers, narrating little clips like, "The church is so lucky." Dad stepped in. "We needed this renovation to keep the youth group safe." And every time she said "Dad," I felt an old ache stir behind my sternum. Not because I wanted to be claimed the way she was, but because I finally understood how long I had let myself be invisible just to keep peace in a home that was never mine. Aunt Marlene stood near the dessert table, and when she saw me, she squeezed my hand and whispered that she still had nightmares about the papers Carl pushed in front of Linda, and I told her quietly that tonight I would not be quiet, and her eyes widened because she knew what that meant. When the pastor introduced the sponsors, Carl strode up as if taking a victory lap, launching into a speech about community, about how families thrive when parents work hard and sacrifice. And he said the word sacrifice as if he alone understood it. And then, as if on cue, he mentioned Kayla's brand new home as an example of building something from the ground up through grit and dedication. And Kayla giggled theatrically and waved at the crowd, and a few polite claps followed. But in that moment, something in me clicked into place with a calm finality. I kept my folder tucked against my side, feeling the weight of each document like an anchor, each transaction a quiet, undeniable truth waiting for daylight. Dan sat beside me, his posture straight, his jaw tense, and when Carl began thanking the community for trusting him, calling himself a man who always honored commitments, I felt Dan's hand subtly tap twice against my knee, the signal we had agreed on, the signal that it was time. When the pastor opened the floor for community comments and questions, giving people a chance to offer gratitude or raise concerns, I stood slowly, not dramatic, not emotional, just steady. And the shift in the room was immediate, because Jenna hardly ever spoke in these settings. Jenna was the polite one, the quiet one, the daughter who smiled small and disappeared early, so when I raised my hand and the pastor nodded gently toward me, the entire room seemed to inhale together. I walked to the front, not rushing, and placed my folder on the podium, noticing the small projector set up for event announcements, exactly the tool Dan and I knew would be there. I looked at Carl, who smiled too widely and said, "Well, honey, did you have something to add?" And his tone suggested he expected me to praise him or speak about gratitude, but what I felt was a calm that bordered on cold clarity. "You talk a lot about providing, Carl," I said quietly into the microphone, and the microphone made every syllable unmistakably clear. "So can we talk about the money Mom set aside for me that you used to finish Kayla's basement?" The silence that followed was almost physical, like a pressure pushing against the walls, and Kayla's phone dropped to her side, recording forgotten. I opened the folder and lifted the first page, the credit union statement showing the redemption of my education bonds, and when I held it up, Dan tapped his screen, and the exact page appeared on the projector behind me, large, crisp, undeniable. "This was the bond my grandmother purchased for me when I was 11. I said redeemed early and transferred into a joint account, and then a withdrawal a week later to purchase a new truck, the same truck Carl drove to every job site." A ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd, and Carl stepped forward as if to interrupt, but the pastor lifted a hand gently toward him, signaling him to wait. I continued reading each line calmly. The date the life insurance from my grandfather arrived, the date it disappeared into Carl's personal account, the date the funds marked for my future wedding were moved and then spent on construction for Kayla's new home, the basement that now served as her content studio. Every time I named a transaction, Dan put the corresponding document on the projector, not arguing, not editorializing, just showing the truth exactly as it existed. Carl laughed nervously and said, "This is a family misunderstanding and not the place for it." But my voice did not waver when I said, "You made it public when you used my mother's money to pose as a generous father." I then called up the final document, the authorization form from when I was 15, the one Carl told me to sign for grown-up stuff, the one that allowed him to change beneficiaries and take control of funds, meant only for me, and the room turned so still I could hear someone's bracelet slide on a wrist. That was when my attorney, who had been sitting near the back quietly observing, stepped forward and introduced himself as my legal advisor, offering a brief and measured explanation of what misuse of designated funds and elder financial exploitation could look like, speaking not as an accuser, but as an educator, so the room understood the gravity of what had happened. Carl sputtered that everything was handled with Linda's consent, but when the attorney mentioned pressured signatures and violation of beneficiary intent, Carl's face shifted, a flicker of fear replacing his earlier confidence. I closed my folder and looked at the room, not seeking pity, not asking for outrage, only saying, "I am not asking anyone here to pick sides. I just do not want anyone else to sign away their daughter's future, thinking it will be honored." And the pastor bowed his head slightly, a gesture of sorrow and recognition, and in that moment the narrative Carl had built for years cracked wide open under the weight of truth. In the days after the church event, the quiet that followed did not feel like peace, but like the moment after a storm when you can still hear branches settling and gutters dripping. When you know the worst has passed, yet the landscape is permanently altered, and it was in that silence that the first consequences began arriving, not because I hunted them down, but because truth has a habit of traveling farther than the person who speaks it. 2 mornings after the fundraiser, a large client of Carl's construction business sent an email to cancel a remodeling project they had planned for months, and though they phrased it politely and blamed internal restructuring, Aunt Marlene later told me the wife of that client had been at the church that night and whispered to her friend that if he would do that to his stepdaughter, imagine what corners he might cut on their budget, and the thought of his moral compass so boldly displayed on every brochure being questioned by the people he relied on for income would have stung him more than any legal threat. Around the same time, the pastor who had always tried to walk the line between compassion and practicality gently informed Carl that the church would be postponing any new construction projects for the foreseeable future, which was his quiet way of saying, "We cannot put our reputation in the hands of someone who used designated funds for personal gain." And even though he never used those exact words, the message was unmistakable. Kayla stopped posting about her new house for a while, likely because commenters had started asking uncomfortable questions about who paid for what, and she was not ready to face the reality that her curated dream home now carried a shadow she could not filter away. But the most important ripple was the one I created intentionally yet lawfully. The letter my attorney and I drafted with precision, a letter that did not accuse with emotion, but listed facts with timestamps and supporting documentation. A letter sent to Carl with a clear deadline for repayment of the wedding fund, plus a small sum representing damages. A letter copied to Kayla so she could no longer pretend she did not know, and copied to Aunt Marlene because she had witnessed too much over the years to be left in the dark. The letter was calm, professional, non-threatening, yet its clarity was cold and sharp, outlining the transfers, the misuse of funds, the forged adolescent signature, the breach of beneficiary intent, and when Carl received it, he sent me a text that simply said, "We need to talk," which I ignored because we had already talked for years in ways that benefited only him. Carl tried to apply for a refinancing loan a week later, something he needed to stabilize his business after the client cancellations. And without knowing it, he walked straight into a space where I now had a voice, because 2 years earlier, I had accepted a volunteer seat on a credit union advisory board, partly to understand lending processes better, and partly to give back to the community that had quietly supported Mom when she was sick. It was a small board one that reviewed local applications when risk factors were present, and though I did not insert myself into his case, the system assigned the application to our committee because Carl's cash flow had become irregular after recent cancellations. I followed protocol exactly, which meant recusing myself from the vote, but presenting relevant financial concerns during discussion concerns based entirely on documents that were public or directly tied to the credit union's prior interactions with Linda's accounts. I did not embellish. I did not speculate. I only asked the same questions. Any analyst would ask questions about unexplained transfers, complaints filed after the fundraiser, negative community sentiment that could affect loan performance, and the board members, who were older, experienced, and deeply attuned to patterns of financial instability, reached their own conclusion that the risk was too high, and they voted unanimously to decline the refinancing. It was not revenge, it was simply the natural outcome of bringing truth into a space that relied on accuracy to make decisions. Carl's anger simmered under the surface, evident in the terse messages he sent Kayla, visible in the way his voice cracked when he left me a voicemail saying, "This is going too far, Jenna." But even then, he did not apologize. He did not even acknowledge what he had done beyond framing himself as a victim of misunderstanding, and all his messages carried that same tone of entitlement as if he believed he still had the right to manage the narrative. When the deadline from the attorney's letter approached, Carl called my lawyer instead of calling me, and they spoke briefly before Carl agreed to avoid court by making a lump sum transfer equal to the original wedding fund, plus a small compensatory amount, a sum that arrived in my account late on a Tuesday night. I sat at my small kitchen table, the same table Mom had eaten breakfast at during her final months, and I watched the notification appear not with triumph, but with the steady confirmation that a wrong had been named clearly enough that even Carl could not talk his way around it. But I did not touch the money, did not spend a single dollar, because it was not meant for immediate satisfaction. It was not meant to erase the years of being considered the safe one, the stable one, the one who needed nothing. I left the money where it landed untouched, letting it sit as proof that justice is sometimes slow, but always possible when you stop trying to be small for the comfort of others. And as I closed the banking app, I felt the first real exhale I had taken in months, the first moment my shoulders loosened. The first moment I sensed that what came next would not be about revenge, but about reclaiming the parts of my life that had been quietly taken, repurposed, or ignored. The months that followed moved slowly at first, like a heavy train beginning its descent. But once the momentum built, Carl's world slipped faster than he could brace against. And though I never wished for anyone's ruin, I also understood that consequences have their own rhythm, especially when a man has spent years building his house on other people's sacrifices. Contracts he once bragged about securing began evaporating, not because I called anyone, not because I whispered to clients, but because word travels in communities like ours, where people talk quietly after church and compare notes in line at the grocery store, and when trust dissolves, it rarely returns. The bank's decision to decline his refinancing spread through the contractor circle, and more than one business pulled back, worried that his cash flow issues might spill into their schedules, which in this industry is the quickest way to lose work. Then came the tax notice, a polite but stern letter requesting documentation regarding several years of mixed business and personal expenses. And though I had nothing to do with what triggered it, I knew exactly what inconsistency caught their eye because it had been sitting on my spreadsheet, noted and dated from the moment I understood the scope of what he had done. Kayla, meanwhile, had thrown herself into her engagement to a fellow content creator, a man who spoke in brand partnership pitches and used the phrase market potential, like it was a personality trait, and she filmed every step of their journey. But she could not film away the mortgage reminders, piling in, especially when the bank flagged multiple late payments placing the house under review. When the first letter arrived, warning of possible foreclosure if the balance was not brought current, Kayla stopped filming for a week, her silence louder than anything she had ever posted. It was a gray Saturday morning when Carl and Kayla came to my apartment, the same apartment they once mocked as modest, and Kayla stood behind Carl with puffy eyes clutching her phone like it was a tissue, while Carl forced a smile that looked more like a grimace. He cleared his throat and said, "Jenna, you have always been good with money," and the way he said good made it sound like a chore rather than a skill. "And maybe you and Dan could help us refinance, not alone exactly, just co-signing just enough to keep the house in the family, because your mother would want it preserved." Every sentence trembled between command and plea, and Kayla jumped in with a wavering voice, reminding me of Linda, planting small azalea bushes in the yard the first week they moved in, describing the curtains Linda chose for the living room painting, sentimental images that used to make my chest ache, but now felt oddly distant, like memories from a life that belonged to someone else. I listened, not interrupting, not offering comfort, because I had learned that silence can be more powerful than argument, and Carl interpreted my quiet as consideration, which emboldened him. He said, "This does not have to be a big deal. Jenna, you sign, we get the loan. We are out of your hair by spring." And Kayla looked at me with an expression tangled in embarrassment and expectation, as if she believed we were still playing roles assigned when she was the baby and I was the reliable one. But what they did not know, what neither of them could have imagined, was that I had already taken steps weeks earlier, not out of vengeance, but out of a desire to rewrite what that house symbolized, because I had contacted the bank the moment the foreclosure notice became public record, asking for information on the auction timeline through the LLC I used for my rentals, and the bank, following procedure, placed me on the bidder notification list, meaning the moment the property date was set, I would know. It felt surreal at first, the idea of bidding on the house that was built on money meant for me money. My mother marked with her handwriting, money Carl redirected into granite countertops and influencer lighting. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt like the cleanest path. Not revenge, but reclamation. Not keeping the house for myself, but redirecting it to become something my mother would have been proud of, because my plan, one I had mapped meticulously in my private notes, was simple. If I won the property, I would donate it through a partner nonprofit that offered transitional housing for women leaving financially abusive relationships, and install a small plaque near the porch, reading "In memory of Linda Cole," a quiet testament to the woman whose intention had been betrayed. So when Carl finally said, "Well, what do you say, Jenna? Will you help us or not?" I looked at him steadily and answered with a calm he did not expect. "I will not co-sign," I said, "and I will not tie my credit or my future to someone who saw me as optional." Kayla let out a soft gasp as if stunned that the reliable one had stepped out of her script, and Carl's face twisted with frustration, his voice rising as he accused me of spite, asking if I would rather see strangers living in the house my mother decorated. I answered quietly, I would rather see someone live there who understands what it means to have a home taken from you, and the room, small as it was, felt suddenly too large for their certainty and too cramped for their entitlement. Carl stormed out first, muttering that I would regret this when the family fell apart, and Kayla stayed a moment longer, her eyes glossy, her expression flickering between resentment and recognition. Then she whispered, "You could have helped," and walked away, leaving behind a hollow echo of the girl who once believed the world owed her every comfort. And as the door closed, I felt neither triumph nor cruelty, only a steadiness deep in my bones, the kind that comes when you finally stop holding up a structure that was never meant to stand on truth. The vineyard sat on a low Missouri hill, the kind that rolls gently toward the river and catches the late afternoon light in a way that makes everything look softer, kinder. And maybe that was why I chose it, not because it was grand or dramatic, but because it felt like a place where nothing loud or cruel could survive. Our wedding was small, just 50 people, a mix of co-workers who had seen me solve impossible balance sheets, friends who knew my tendency to observe quietly before speaking, a few board members from the credit union who had always treated me with a respect my own family rarely offered, and Aunt Marlene who hugged me so tightly I felt both rooted and released, and she whispered, "Linda would be proud, honey. I can feel it." There were no raised eyebrows about who was missing, no whispers about Carl or Kayla, no subtle glances toward the door as if expecting drama to walk in, uninvited because we had not invited them, and for the first time in my life I planned an event entirely free from the weight of trying to make anyone else comfortable. As I walked down the aisle between rows of wooden chairs, I felt a quiet rise in my chest, not nerves, but a realization that this moment, this day, this peace, belonged to me, and not to the family narrative I had been boxed into for so long. And when Dan reached for my hands, his eyes were steady and warm, making me feel chosen in a way money or promises never could. The ceremony was short, heartfelt, filled with laughter rather than pretense, and when we toasted under strings of soft vineyard lights, I understood deeply that silence could finally mean serenity rather than suppression. That small shift became the first layer of my healing. A few months later, the auction date for Carl's house arrived, and though I had rehearsed the moment in my mind countless times, nothing quite matched the strange calm I felt standing at the back of the county hall, anonymous among a handful of bidders, listening to the realtor read out the parcel number with the same matter-of-fact tone he used for every property. The house looked almost ordinary in the listing photo, its bright paint dulled by overdue maintenance, the yard slightly overgrown, the basement staging lights dimmed without Kayla's relentless filming, and as the bidding started, I felt Dan's hand slip into mine, anchoring me without speaking a word. The LLC registered under my name moved with a quiet precision I had built over years of budgeting, saving, analyzing, and using money as a tool rather than a weapon. And when the auctioneer announced sold, there was no dramatic music, no gasp, no grand reversal, only a clean finality, a small nod of acknowledgement from the clerk, and the soft exhale of a woman who had spent too many years thinking she needed to stay small. The win did not feel like triumph over Carl so much as a restoration of what had been misused, as if a balance that had been tilted through years of manipulation finally settled back into place. When the paperwork finalized, I met with the director of the Midwest Women's Housing Initiative, a woman named Ruth who had spent 3 decades helping survivors of financial and emotional control rebuild their lives. And as I handed her the deed transfer documents, she looked up at me with a mixture of gratitude and curiosity. I explained the condition not as a demand, but as a tribute. A small plaque in the kitchen reading, This home stands because one woman refused to be invisible, and Ruth nodded slowly, saying quietly that stories like mine helped others believe freedom was possible. That sentence stayed with me longer than any confrontation ever had. I did not tell Carl or Kayla what happened to the house, not because I wanted to hide it, but because I no longer needed them to witness anything I did. Justice does not require an audience, and healing rarely needs applause. What mattered was that the home built with my mother's money was now a sanctuary rather than a stage, a place where someone else could catch their breath after being erased or diminished, and in a way that felt like delivering the exact opposite of what Carl had done. In time, Dan and I moved into our own home, a modest 3-bedroom place with creaking floors and a small yard. Nothing flashy, but entirely ours, purchased with my savings, my rental income, and yes, a portion of the restitution Carl sent to avoid a public lawsuit. Sitting in our living room on the first night surrounded by mismatched furniture and boxes still waiting to be unpacked, I felt something close to wonder, because this house represented not revenge, but independence, the kind that grows quietly until one day it is solid enough to stand on. As life settled, I began shaping an idea that had been circling my thoughts for months, a scholarship fund for women who reminded me of the girl I used to be, the one who saved, quietly worked quietly, endured quietly, hoping someone would eventually see her. I named it Linda's Fund for Quiet Daughters, established through the community college where I had once studied accounting, and structured it so the interest from my portfolio and a portion of my rental income would sustain it long term. The fund offered small but meaningful grants for women returning to school or leaving financially controlling households, and each time I signed off on an approval letter, I felt a soft pulse of purpose, as if I were stitching back pieces of a story my mother never got to finish. In moments of reflection, usually late at night when the house was quiet and Dan was reading beside me, I thought about the years I spent believing that being the fine one meant shrinking, accommodating, absorbing hurt so others would not be inconvenienced, and I realized how wrong that belief had been. For 34 years, I assumed silence protected me, when in reality it only preserved the comfort of those who benefited from my quiet. Finding my voice did not mean shouting. It meant choosing, deciding, reclaiming. So when I say that I no longer let anyone rewrite my story, it is not defiance, it is simply truth. And if you have ever been told you will be fine while something meant for you was handed to someone louder, I hope my story stays with you. If you were ever the quiet one in a loud family, tell me in the comments. And if you want more stories about money justice and women who refuse invisibility, you can subscribe so you do not miss what comes next.